My name is Alex Bennett, and I am the owner of Milwaukee Music Lessons. I've been teaching for about 15 years. I've worked with over 300 students personally, and I teach guitar and drums. I also have experience with piano, voice, bass, and a few other instruments. I work with beginners, intermediate players, and even advanced musicians. Since episode 13, we have been talking about the 5 pillars of learning music. We've covered technical ability, we've covered experience, we've covered music theory, ear training, and today is the final pillar. We are talking about creativity. So, what role does creativity play in music education? Is it optional? Does it help you learn faster? Is it necessary to become a complete musician? By the end of this episode, you will understand what creativity really is, how it affects progress, and how it looks at different ages and skill level. Let's break it down. Now, when I say creativity, I don't just mean writing songs. Creativity in music means using what you know in a much more flexible way. It can mean things like improvising, it can mean changing rhythms, adding embellishments, writing small musical ideas, or just making your own creative choices within a song. Creativity is not necessarily random playing, and it's not ignoring technique or skipping fundamentals. It's much more of a structured freedom, for lack of a better way of saying it. It's taking your technique, your theory, your ear, and your experience and using them all. If technique is learning the words, creativity is speaking the language. Of course, I want to take a few minutes to talk about why it matters, and I'm going to try and break it down at just about every single level of musicianship that I possibly can. So let's talk about why creativity matters at every level. So, if you're a beginner, if you're somebody who's brand new or with relatively limited experience, it makes learning much more fun and personal. It improves your memory. It helps you build a little bit more confidence in the early stages, and it helps you feel a little bit more like you own the music, what you're working on. When beginners take time to change one rhythm or they add a small idea, a little melody, something like that, their brain starts to connect on a more deep level with the music. A lot of research shows that active learning improves your retention. So when students create, they tend to remember things better. Now, if you've had a little while or you're a little more into that intermediate stage, you've got some experience, then things start to change just a little bit. So it connects. If you're in the intermediate stage, you've had some time to do some theory. So that means you're going to connect the theory to a little bit more of the real sound. It's going to start improving your problem solving ability. It's going to strengthen a little bit more of your timing and your active listening. And it's definitely going to increase your motivation. The improvisation has a tendency to force your brain to process things faster. And that helps build a stronger, like, neural pathways because you, as the students, you're starting to decide things in real time. And that speeds up how your brain processes things internally. Pretty fascinating stuff. Now, if you are much more advanced, let's say you've got years of experience, you've been playing live, you're working with much more advanced techniques, concepts, solos, things like that, then this is where creativity really starts to build your unique brand. It builds your own style. It starts to build a musical identity for you. It's going to increase your ability to adapt to a lot of different situations. And of course, it's going to actually prepare you for real performance. People who are advanced players who never create, they often hit a plateau. They can copy to a really high level, but they struggle if there's any sort of change. If somebody in the band, for example, asks for something a little bit different or they want to make it their own, people who never handle this creative spot, they tend to miss out and they start to fall behind. Creativity tends to build much more flexibility, and flexibility often builds mastery. Okay, so let's get down into some more details. We're going to try and talk about what this looks like in real life, and we're going to break it down by a few instruments. Because we focus here at the school a lot more on guitar, piano, drums, voice, that's what we're going to start to talk about. So let's go instrument by instrument, level by level, and try and break this down a little bit. So if you're a guitar player and you're just beginning, somebody who's a beginner might change their strumming patterns just a little bit. They might decide that they want to add an extra little bit of upstroke. They might make small choices in changes for their rhythmic control or maybe subtle variations on chords, things like that, that they start to implement. If you're more of an intermediate player, intermediate players, they might start to improvise over the top of really simple chord loops, 3, 4 chord progressions that are very simple and repetitive. For example, like a 12-bar blues would be a great one. Even just using the pentatonic scale, one of the most popular beginner scales that's out there. And a lot of this starts to really connect the theory of what they've been learning to the sound that they're starting to generate. Now, moving beyond that, let's say we get into the advanced levels. So, advanced players might start to completely rewrite solo sections. They can take what an artist had already done, they understand it, and they're able to make it their own or even rebuild it from the ground up. They might start to change chord voicings, lots of different variations of the same types of chords. And at this point, they're really starting to shape their tone a lot more and generate much more emotional connection. They're not just playing the notes, it's a feeling. It becomes an intuition, if you will. So if we move on to another instrument, so let's say another like piano, for example. So beginner levels. Beginners in piano tend to focus a lot more on dynamic changes. They start to play certain phrases softer, and then maybe they come to another phrase and they start to play louder. It's one of the inherent, we'll say, advantages of a piano. In fact, that's actually why it's called what it is, the piano forte, which is the loud soft. Use that at trivia night. The beginner stages, it's really easy to start building musical expression, and that's what a lot of beginner piano players focus on when it comes to improvisation and creativity. If you're a little bit more in the intermediate stage, an intermediate student might create something that's a little bit more of a left-hand pattern instead of necessarily copying exactly what's inside your textbook. And at this point, you're starting to maybe not do both hands creatively independent, but like one hand is going to start to have some differentiations in it. So left hand, you might play something a little bit different, or right hand, you might have some slightly different embellishments, things like that. If you start to get into the advanced structure, advanced pianists, they start to like work on reharmonization. They maybe create their own intro, their own beginning or endings, and they really start to understand a structure on a much, much deeper level. If you're a drummer, beginners might add one simple fill at the end of a group of bars. So maybe every 4 bars or every 8 measures, they start to do something a little bit different. And this really builds a whole new type of counting and confidence. Intermediate players, so intermediate drummers start to move different placements of various beats, things like kick and snare, especially, or they can shift a hi-hat pattern just a little bit. And they're beginning to understand the concept of groove a little bit more. And then if you start to get into that advanced level, advanced musicians, they start to improvise their transitions a bit more, or they start to change their dynamics in different ways, whether that's like just overall volume or choosing which beats to accent or emphasize in different ways. And they're starting to build much more of a musical awareness where it's not just them, it's also the context, everything surrounding them. And then finally, if you're a vocalist, beginner vocalists, they start to change their phrasing just a little bit. They hold out notes just a little bit longer, and they're starting to focus on that foundation of being able to have better breath control. Breath, obviously, is the support that builds your entire voice. And so this is usually where most of the creativity starts, is in different breathing controls and breathing patterns. If you're an intermediate player, intermediate singers start to experiment more with harmony, upper and lower. Upper is generally easier for most people, but maybe lower a little bit. Or they're starting to control their tone, their timbre a little bit more, and they're getting more of a controlled sound. When you start to get into the advanced levels, so an advanced vocalist is going to start to add more difficult runs. They're going to start to add embellishments, but they're also learning to use it in a way that's creatively tasteful, where it's in places it actually serves the song, not necessarily just a run for a run's sake. They're starting to maybe develop a little bit more of a musical maturity, okay? Now, you might be saying at this point, you're like, okay, Alex, I understand the ideas, but this really only works if you're an adult, right? Not necessarily. So, we're going to take just a second to also break things down a little bit by creativity at age level. And I guess we're going to try and maybe break it down about like what creativity looks like depending on your age or your kid's age for that matter. So, young kids, we're talking like preteens and younger. You need to have more of a guided creativity. A lot of creativity happens in short, controlled experiments where you're just giving simple choices. Choose A, B, or C, and this is what you get to pick from. This could be like choosing different tempos or speeds, or it might be choose rhythm A or rhythm B. You're keeping structure, but you're still giving choices so that way they're independently choosing and listening and deciding what they like. Now, as you start to get a little bit more mature and upper in that age level, teenagers start to want to develop their own identity. They want ownership, and of course, they want a certain amount of freedom. So this is where the age of maybe songwriting becomes much more powerful. I can say that from experience because when I was a teenager, that was when songwriting really started to appeal to me. And this is where learning how to improvise or creatively write becomes much more powerful, and you start to build your own confidence here. Now, adults have a different problem, which is that adults tend to fear being wrong and they need permission to explore. It's funny because adults share some of the same problems that the children have. You get unlimited opportunities, and so you might as well just go for it. But for a lot of adults, they're so focused on doing things right that they will hold themselves back by never giving themselves permission to do something wrong. So usually in the beginning, we need to start with something that's more of a structured framework. And then as they start to develop confidence, they can go a little bit more on their own. Basically, adults tend to grow faster when they realize that creativity is actually something that's allowed. It's not just a play within the lines type of thing. It starts to lower your fear. And once you build that confidence and you do it a bunch, then it's going to start to increase your actual engagement. So now comes to the big question, right? Does creativity actually help you learn faster? And the short answer is yes, but only when it's built upon fundamentals. We're not taking random shots at a dartboard here. This isn't a game of Battleship. We want to have strategic goals is what we want. We looked up some studies in preparation for this, and studies in music cognition tend to show that improvisation increases your brain activity across both motor listening and also decision-making areas. So that means that more parts of your brain tend to be active at one time when you're doing creative ideas. This means that when you have more connections, those connections are stronger learning. But creativity without structure is where people fall apart. So technique comes first, and then afterwards, creativity strengthens that technique. So it's not necessarily a shortcut. It's more like an amplifier of what already exists, which is part of why in this series we've saved creativity for last. We tried to put it down the line in the order of what we think is important. Big picture. I think most of us have some sort of aspirations of creativity in some way, shape, or form. We all recognize that music is a form of expression. But despite that, once we start to get into it, we focus so much on playing within the lines that we create a fear of playing outside the lines. And the thing is that music is not just about copying songs. It's about becoming a musician, right? Technique builds control. Theory builds understanding. Ear training builds your awareness. Experience builds exposure. And then creativity builds ownership. And ownership builds confidence. Confidence builds long-term growth. And when students create, they internalize. When they internalize, they remember. And when they remember, they improve faster. And that is how you become a much more complete musician. So today we've talked about creativity as the final pillar of learning. We really tried to define it, and we explained, most importantly, why it matters. We showed how it looks on guitar, piano, drums, and voice a bit, and we talked about how it changes a bit by age and skill levels. My key takeaway for you, if you take nothing else away from this, is that creativity is not an extra, but it really is an essential tool for learning. But it has to be built on top of a pre-existing structure. So with that, I'm going to leave you guys here, but I will give you a little bit of a teaser for the next episode. We're going to shift away from theory to much more action. We've taken some time to talk to our teachers, and we're going to try and share the most practical advice for each instrument that we have in each episode. I'm not entirely sure how we'll structure it yet because we're still asking the teachers stuff, so I don't want to promise anything that I can't deliver on here. But we're going to focus on practical advice and simple adjustments, stuff that you at home can apply immediately. At least one powerful idea per instrument. Hopefully more than that, though. We'll see, though, what all the teachers come up with. We want to come up with their best quick fixes and like things that they've seen across students that have been the most helpful for them. So if you want faster progress and clearer direction, you're not going to want to miss that episode. If this episode helped you, please take a second, like the video, leave a comment about how creativity shows up in your playing, and definitely subscribe if you want to make sure you don't miss the next episode. Our goal is simple. We want you to grow as musicians, and we want you to feel confident. So hopefully you've got some ideas about how music can be something that you own and not just something you copy. My name is Alex Bennett, and I appreciate you guys tuning in, and we'll see ya in the next episode.